And we are going on with our second speaker, Robert Corban, who is an assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Mississippi, where he has returned to teach the histories of fascism, capitalism, and war in Europe. He's also at work on two projects. The first, a manuscript based on his dissertation at the Columbia University on the mobilization of agriculture in Mussolini's Italy. And the second, a collaboration across multiple fields, disciplines, and media on the Second World War in the Mediterranean. His talk today is titled New Order or World Order, New Perspectives on an Old Problem in the History of Fascist Italy. And I can assure you this paper has been retweaked and rewritten last night, so it's going to be something really new.
Well, if I could, then I would like to start with a word or two of thanks. The first for Sky and the organizing committee, the second for the Mosse program, La Sapienza, and the American Academy. And last but not least for our moderator, our commentator, and our commenter, and the fellow panelists here. That's for Elissa, Terry, Amy, and Austin. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be a part of this panel and to be here at the seminar among friends, new and old, this weekend in Rome. Now, if I could, I'd also like to start with a bit of a disclaimer or two, because, well, for one, I'm not sure I knew this paper of mine would be sent around to the whole of the seminar, but for another, with the blessing of Terry and Elissa, I went back, I did go back and rewrite or rework much of it last night until well after midnight, and then again at lunch. So with the presentation too. So I'm not quite sure what's on this presentation. And so, so there. And then for a final kind of disclaimer here, I am a historian. I am a rather old-fashioned one, even if I have a rather new face. And I write and I think about fascism like a historian. And I'd like to think that I think about fascism like a line of historians into which I've been sort of trained that stretches from Vicky de Grazia to Bob Paxson and Angela Tasca before him, and that is to define fascism is above all to write its history. And so that's how I'd like to speak about or define fascism this afternoon in this presentation. But if you'd like to speak more about the definition of fascism, or if we'd like to speak more about fascism in the present as well as the past, then I'd be delighted to do so this afternoon in the question and answer, or if not, this evening at the bar. Now, and that's the final kind of disclaimer here. I'm about to speak loud. I'm about to speak fast. And not for Manuela, but to continue to kind of pump some piss and vinegar, as well as to provide a new perspective, and to provide time for the other panelists in the question and answer. So, like I said, I rewrote the paper of this presentation last night, and so I'll start much as I started in the paper, but then I'm going to take this paper as it is, but a part or a fragment or a piece of a paper on the foreign policy, the new order, or the vision of world order, the perspective of global and world history on fascist Italy. I'll take out the stakes, and I'll take a few steps back. I'll draw them out a bit more for the purposes of our seminar towards some of the broader kind of conversations that we've had about the comparison of the conditions, and perhaps the comparison of the conditions of fascism from this weekend. And then perhaps we can speak and think together about what this foreign policy, what this vision of world order, what this perspective of world history might tell us about the present as well as the past of fascism, whether in America or for, I think, just the second or third time this week in Russia. So again, I will start much as I did with the paper, New Order or World Order, New Perspectives on an Old Problem in the History of Fascist Italy. So the problem of the sources, scale, and scope of foreign policy or visions of world order is an old one in the history of fascist Italy. Indeed, it stretches as far back as the March on Rome, when Salvemini, Sforza, and Sturzo, among others, set out the line of argument that there was no such policy in fascist Italy. Or if there was, it was no more than a policy of bluster, bluff, or bread and circuses that sprang from the mind of Mussolini. It was this line that the likes of Dennis Mack Smith would pick up after the Second World War and push to a point that it was not just bluff, but buffoonery on the part of the sawdust Caesar in Rome. Then, in the 1980s, Renzo Di Felice and Rosario Cortoraro and others pushed back that there was indeed such a policy and an ideology, that of the peso determinante, in which Mussolini, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and fascist Italy, much as in liberal Italy, would exert their weight among the central powers, the great powers of Europe, to exact concessions for a new civilization across the Adriatic, the Aegean, and the Africa. Since the 1990s, however, McGregor Knox, Robert Mallet, and John Gooch have taken a harder line on the foreign policy and ideology of fascist Italy and argued that Mussolini, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and above all the armed forces were less revisionist, more revolutionist in a bid for conquest, foreign and domestic, in a new order that would take them quite far from Mare Nostrum. So this old debate about the new order of Mussolini, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the armed forces, has served nonetheless critical purposes for historians since the Second World War. Above all, it's reminded Italianists of the importance of the continuities between policy and ideology, the foreign and the domestic, or the ideological and the international in the histories of Italy, Europe, or the Mediterranean. However, this rather narrow focus on Mussolini and his generals has been such that scholars have found themselves without a sense for the broader sort of ideas or the broader sets of interests among the fascists in the party, in parliament, or in Italy itself that often provided the source and the force of the policies and the ideas of Mussolini, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the general staff. It's fallen to the Marxists, the Catholics, and a more recent generation of global historians of the access to recover the entanglements of ideas and ideologues across Europe, Africa, and Asia. But even still, the debates about the domestic sources of foreign policy, structure and intention of continentalism and globalism in the foreign policy of the new order of fascist Italy do not compare to the ones in Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan. To that end, this paper takes the new perspective from the most recent generation of global historians and stakes a modest claim about the old problem of the new order in fascist Italy, with a look at one set of interests in the party, the chamber and the Senate, whose ideas would prove to have a real influence over those of Mussolini, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the armed forces. And so then in the paper, I begin to profile this set of interests, this coalition in Italy who called themselves the plow and the bow after D'Annunzio, but who came to call ever more for a new order within and beyond the Mediterranean. And I bring out how their ideas for this new order in a line to make of all seas Mare Nostrum, from the March on Rome or the First World War, the Long Great War, to bring in the Italo-Turkish War of 1911-1912, through the Depression and the Second Italo-Senussi War to the Second Italo-Abyssinian War and the Second World War. And I bring it around to how it provides a new perspective on the old problem, the sources, scale, and scope of the new order of fascist Italy, and how it promises new answers to old questions about the concepts behind fascism, the contours of their empire, the causes, conduct, and consequences of war across Italy, Europe, and the Mediterranean, and so on. However, what I would like to do now is to stop here, to take these stakes, but also to take a step back. In a sense, I'd like to speak a bit more myself about how I, from my perspective, or the perspective of world history, see these ideas of Mussolini, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the armed forces, and then perhaps to speak about the same in the party, or even more in Parliament or in Italy, from the First World War through the March on Rome to the Depression and the Second World War. And then, from there, I'll bring it round and out to see or think if we can see if we can think together this afternoon about how this case, the context of this case, the context of the new order, or the vision or visions of world order in fascist Italy, how this case connects, compares and otherwise clarifies the conditions of the foreign policies, new order, or visions of world order of fascism in the present. And so to bring us around to the question of what this perspective, not just a transnational or a transimperial perspective, but a global perspective, a truly global perspective, or as I do prefer, a world historical perspective, can tell us about fascism in the present. Now, Mussolini, for his part, his perspective was global from the start, at least if we start in the First World War. There should be one more slide here. There we are. Of course, we aren't familiar enough with the lines from his article in the Popolo d'Italia on the armistice. The whole earth trembles. All continents are riven with the crisis. There's not a single part of the planet which is not shaken within the cyclone, end quote. However, not long thereafter, as far as back as April 1919, we find the other line in Il Popolo d'Italia, a far more pointed one about the need for a new order in general and a policy of continents in particular, and how, unless the Italians and the Europeans, one and all, quote, abstract themselves from the nation to save the nation, then the Italians and Europeans would, again, quote, reduced to fragments, become a colony of the other two continents, indeed, within the war of continents on the horizon that is between Asia and America. We must, in the words of Mussolini, consider the continent. Now, with this line on the new order in general, the policy of continents in particular, Mussolini had picked up a line, indeed a kind of connection, that could be found across Italy and indeed across Europe after the First World War, from Nitti to Lenin. And the kind of vision that Nitti then pursued with Asia or Eurasia and Russia, as well as America. But I'd like to suggest Mussolini pursued it much farther than the liberals after the March on Rome. Indeed, we know from the documents of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mussolini had in mind a bloc for the continent that is a bloc against the British as well as the Americans, the international, often Masonic plutocracy, as he called it, as far back as the winter of 1922, 1923. And I'd like to suggest that that idea remained there. That is, this vision of the world remained in the mind of Mussolini, together with his other ideas to sort of outflank the British in the Mediterranean, whether through the Middle East or through Kenya, through 1925, with his ideas to forge a broad front for a common action with the Russians and the Germans against the Anglo-Saxons on into the Second World War, not just in his ideas about Eurafrica, but a vision of the world, a racial one, on which, more in a moment, in which the Italians, Germans, Russians, and Japanese would, in his words, rule the world in the book, the unfinished one, about the world five decades on, that he would call Europa 2000. But enough for now on Mussolini, I think. I hope. Because for now, I'd like to speak for this moment, between 1925 and 1926 and the Great Depression, about some of the flankers around Mussolini in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Armed Forces, but above all, or first and foremost, perhaps, in the party and in Parliament, or the Chamber and the Senate in Fascist Italy. You know, it's kind of wild. The flankers in Parliament, indeed the fascists themselves in the party, have somehow sort of become the exotic others in the history of Fascist Italy. We delight, for reasons I don't care to know, in the details of the lives, the personal lives of these individuals, and we sort of sprinkle them for little hits of titillation throughout our histories of Fascist Italy. But in fact, these sorts of individuals in Parliament and the party are not just sorts of individuals, but sets of interests. And in that sense, a sort of structure as well as a set of intentions. And indeed, it's among such individuals, among such interests, I suggest that we ought to search anew for the source and again, the force of the ideas of or visions of Mussolini, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or the Armed Forces. Indeed, it was among these individuals, where are they? Come on. Yes. All right. In these interests, which we can see among others here, Guido Jung, the ex-nationalist of Fratelli Jung, of his vast plantation in the Conquistadora in Palermo, Guido Jung of the Azienda Agricola Jung, into which he ventured ever more with his brothers in Cyrenaica, or Guido Jung of the Ministry of Finance and his interventions in Washington. And we can see here in Costanzo Ciano, that is Ciano the Elder, who was also an ex-nationalist, but when it came down to it, or it came to the March on Rome, he was a fascist from Livorno with his interests or his enterprises with Agnelli and Fiat, his interest in Florio, the vast operation, indeed the empire of shipping and shipbuilding across the Mezzogiorno, the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic, and his interest in Whitehead and Fume, that is in torpedoes, and his interest in silos, that is in storage for cereals, citrus, other such products, in ports from Genova to Civitavecchia, and his own interventions in the Ministry of the Marina, as well as the Ministry of Communications. And we see them together, that is, we see Jung and Ciano here together as the plow and the bow in Parliament in 1925, 1926, and above all, the elections in 1924, in which we see this sort of wave of ex-nationalists, above all, from the Mezzogiorno that sort of overwhelm the chamber. Now, if these were the sort of individuals, these were the interests, then what were their ideas? What were the visions of Jung, Ciano, or the plow and the bow in the party and Parliament? Well, in short, it was similar to Mussolini, or at least it was similar in the sense that it was global, with an eye to America as well as on Europe. That is, how or if it might find the funds for this vision of the world in America or the House of Morgan, as well as how or where it might find the friends for it in Europe. That is, how the Italians might sort of take the finance from America, take this world order, in a sense, from America, and turn it to their advantage. I heard this point here about Ethiopia, right? And we know now, we have the sources now that show us that there was, in fact, a loan on the table to develop Ethiopia even after the invasion. But in another sense, this vision was different, right? Or at least it was a vision with a definition that was different. It was more defined. It was defined as far back as the Panic of 1908 and the Italo-Turkish War of 1911-1912, when Jung here began to beat the drum for the great proletarian of Italy, for the struggle for markets, and a march that would take him, and after the March on Rome, the Mariage crisis, the elections of 1924, into, and the fascists with him, into the Mare Nostrum, which Mussolini declared on his trip to North Africa in 1926, through Eurafrica and on to a vision of the world, a vision of world order that was, in the words of another member of this coalition from the legislature of 1929 to 1934, to make of all seas Mare Nostrum. All right, so that was kind of quick. I don't know how I'm doing on time here. But Are we good? Spectacular. All right. So again, that was quick, but I do want to make sure that I'm able to kind of bring us back around to the bigger question about the conditions, the constraints, the context of this new order, this vision of world order, this fascism, and compare it perhaps to the same in the present, and then the broader question of what the perspective of world history might tell us about fascism. So if you'd like to read more about the ideas, the interests of the plow and the bow, then take a look at the paper, at least the notes from the paper. I need to move on to the depression now. And what happens when the conditions upon which this vision of world order, and indeed the world order itself, begins to crumble. And then perhaps the connections, the conflicts with other such visions into the Second World War. And so as I write in the paper there, we have this sort of fall in prices and the purchases of the products, of the fruits, as well as the funds of the funders upon which this idea, this order was based or bounded together. And in turn, the rise in the protests of the producers, the products. And so this sort of deterioration, or in the words of Gramsci, this disaggregation of blocks, agrarian and otherwise, across Italy, Europe, the Mediterranean. And it's in and out of this crisis, I'd like to suggest, that comes the demand for resources, that is, for some form of foreign exchange across Italy, Europe, and Asia. And it's out of this demand that Mussolini, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the armed forces made their bid for Eurafrica and Abyssinia. And in the success or the failure, perhaps the sort of fulfillment of that vision, if we want, the fascists find themselves made into the bottom half of the new order in Europe, in a word, the garden of not Europe, but the Third Reich. And so it's also out of this kind of demand too, right? We have the kind of final bid, a final idea from Mussolini, which is, in his words, again, a racial one as well as a global one. In the words of Michael Geyer, a racist counterworld with a global division of labor here, which we can kind of take here, from this issue of Difesa della Razza, as well as this illustration of Eurafrica, in which the races of the Italians, the Germans, the Japanese, and the Russians would, again, rule the world into the world of Europa 2000. And so Mussolini kind of continues to come back to this idea of continents, an order of continents, a war of continents, a clash of continents, in which the races of Europe and perhaps now of Asia, or the East as well as the West, but otherwise the North must subdue, rule over the races, or the sort of hordes of brown masses of Africa and the South, in this sort of idea, this sort of vision that sounds like a product of the crisis of empire after the Second World War, or the Cold War, the refugee crisis of 2015, as much as it does, the First World War. However, I don't want to linger too long on that idea either. We can come back around to Europe 2000 in the Q&A. All right. Oh, yeah. And these are some other images I found on Google at about 2 a.m. That reminded me of Dagmar. And so I learned so much. And so I thought the one on the right was interesting. In particular, it's a kind of, insofar as that, you have two races together, and something that's dying between them. Anyway, we'll come back to that too. On to the big question about the comparisons between this case, the conditions of this case, vision of world order in fascist Italy across the Second World War. But again, to be clear, with this question of comparison, I don't want to fall back into the question of definition, or how this condition measures up, doesn't measure up, doesn't muddle our models of fascism or empire in space, because to be honest, I find it rather boring. And so instead, I want to push on to the question of comparison between the conditions, the context, and time. I want to do so now in 3 points. And then we could speak about how this perspective of world history tells us, or what it tells us about fascism in the past and the present. So the first point is about the conditions, the constraints, the context of the world order, or the world order itself, between the Depression, that is the long Depression of 1873, 1899, through the panic of 1908 into the shock of the First World War, as an order that was built on the British Empire, or rather on the economic, that is the commercial naval power in and of the British Empire, but that was shaken with the First World War and rebuilt, indeed bound and determined in Versailles, Genoa, or a return to the gold standard, and if not Washington itself, then the Washington Naval Conference. And so the economic, financial, naval power of the United States. And until that order itself was shaken to the point of collapse in the Depression of the Second World War, because again, I must insist here, it's this order and this sort of struggle within it, right, and against that order that provides the source, the force of the break from it when it collapses after the Depression. There's a lot of comparisons here. Again, with the conditions of fascism in the present, we could talk about the First World War or the Depression and the financial crisis, in which we find the same sort of shock, in turn the same sort of shake-up, new institutions, central banks, new interventions in the economy at home, and then again abroad, and with these sort of scramble for resources, whether in the Mediterranean after the First World War, the Black Sea after the financial crisis, and new ideas or new orders, whether of the Russian Empire, a new one for Mr. Putin, or the one we all saw on Twitter the other day with Canada and Mexico, with the U.S. that stretched across North America from Mr. Trump. However, that brings me to the second word, the second point, the second conclusion about these ideas, these visions of world order, and this world order itself, and that is about autarky, isolationism, or even protectionism. And I'm afraid that word is hogwash, or nonsense, not just in the sense that we should throw these words out, but in the sense that these words, autarky, isolationism, protectionism, are food for the hogs, food for the pigs, the fascists, who often, at least in Italy, use these words with adjectives like maximum or minimum, but more often as an advertisement, as propaganda, behind which there's often a bid for revisionism, a bid to remake the world, whether through friends in Europe or funds from America, or a break, a radical break from the world order for a new order. Geyer, Charles Zara, Nick Mulder, and other friends of mine have called a bid for autonomy in a condition of globality, the dialectic between integration and autonomy that does define the global age. No one who's read the minutes of the Commission for Defense in Mussolini's Italy cannot see just how sort of cynical, he was, just how sort of strategic he was with this use of the word autarky. He knew it was nonsense, and he still fed it to the Italians. So again, I wish it didn't need to be said, but I think it does. I think it does need to be said once more. This idea that Trump is an isolationist or even a protectionist is nonsense too. It's clear that he, like mercantilists before him, right, sees tariffs as a tool, right? In this case, a bargaining tool in a bid to make or remake the world. And even before the press conference this week, he appointed all of these hawks for a confrontation with the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese, one and all, which, whatever we make of that policy, right, wrong, or indifferent, as a deterrent, it's not isolationist, not in practice, not in theory. That brings me to the third point, the final point, and that is about this vision of the world order. I think for this, and that is about the vision of the future among the fascists in the present as well as the past. It seems there are quite a few such visions, more or less apocalyptic, among the fascists from the War of Continents after the First World War, Europa 2000, before the Second World War, to the War of Continents, the other sort of racist counterworlds about which we've spoken this weekend in America, Europe, and Asia. I think I'll leave that point there on the table for now, though, and bring us back around to the final point, and that is what this perspective of global or world history might tell us about fascism in the present as well as the past. So with respect to the people who sort of spoken before me here in this room and in other rooms around Rome, I'm afraid the focus into this sort of fixation on transnational, transimperial, perhaps the old cultural history, we lose sight of quite a lot, and perhaps we lose one of the sort of lenses to understand, or at least to ask certain questions about fascism. I see no reason that we should transcend anything, much less the sort of categories of the nation or empire, in our analyses of fascism. Rather, we need to make a turn, one that I thought Pam and Lorenzo described so well, that I think Pam, Brian, and Diana have done so well to bring cultural history into the new material history. I'd suggest, as Professor Pergo, Professor Bartow, Professor Roseman have suggested now too, we need to take a step back to see all the ideas, all the interests, all the conditions, and all the context in the perspective of a new world history, or in the words of Brian and Paxton before him, a new synthesis in the study of fascism, lest we are unable to understand this century or the next. Thank you very much.